After the 20-minute rest, and it's going to look pretty much the same, now you can add the salt. If you added the salt earlier on, immediately it would absorb the liquid and it would start tightening. And you can really see the difference. And now I'm going to knead the bread for 7 minutes on a stand mixer, medium-low speed. And after about 5 minutes, I'll look and see the consistency and show you how to tell if you need to add more liquid or more dry ingredients. The bread dough has been kneading now for 7 minutes, and let's check to see the consistency. The first thing that I can see is that there's no dough around the bowl, which is great. Now I'm going to check the texture of the dough. And I want this to be a stiff dough because when I add the cranberries, they're still wet, and so they're going to moisten the dough further. But the main thing that I want to see is, have I kneaded it enough? In other words, is it stretchy? And some people like to do what they call the window test, where you stretch it really thin. But with whole wheat flour, you never really get a good membrane because it's rough. It has the bran, which is sharp, and so it breaks through. So basically, you just want to see that this dough has some stretch to it and looks smooth. And say it were still really sticky, I would just mix it on low speed and pinch in a little bit more flour and knead it just until it's incorporated. I could do that also when I'm kneading it. Or if it's too stiff, you know, it's hard to add water to a dough that's already mixed. If you were to add a teaspoon, it would take a long time for it to evenly integrate. So I just spritz in a little with a water atomizer for plants. And then it just takes seconds to incorporate. Now, in order to roll out a dough that is this well developed, it's going to be very stretchy. You'll see when I take it off. So I like to let it sit for 10 minutes covered. You always cover dough so it doesn't crust. But first I'm going to check and see what it's like. I knead it lightly. Remember I said I finish things off by hand? The final dough, so you can really get a feel of what dough is supposed to feel like when you do this. See, this is a beautiful, smooth, putty-like dough, and it feels so lovely. I mean, this is why I want everybody to bake bread. It just makes you feel so terrific holding this piece of dough. So I'm going to take some dough that has been sitting for 10 minutes and roll it out. Because look what happens when I try to roll this one. And actually, it may surprise me. I may be able to roll it without too much trouble. Whoops. Okay, we always need to add a little flour. I'm rolling it on this new product called Roule Pat. Roule means roll in French. And this way you don't have to add as much flour because things don't stick to it too much. Also, the Roule Pat sticks to the surface of the counter, and so any other mat would just be moving as I'm rolling it. So you can see that this one really isn't quite ready for rolling because it's giving me too much of a battle trying to shrink back in. But I have ready one that has been sitting for 10 minutes. And you'll see the difference of how stretchy and easy it is now to roll out. And you can do this with your fingertips, but it's so much faster with a rolling pin. Now, there are some people who start putting the nuts and the cranberries in when they mix the dough. But what happens is that the soft cranberries that have been softened by the water end up completely pulverizing and integrating into the bread. And the beauty of this bread is that you have the texture and the beauty of the red cranberries and not just a bread that's all one color. So do it as wide or as big as you can easily because it makes it easier to add these ingredients. These are the cranberries that we soaked earlier in order to get the liquid and to soften the cranberries. And now I'm going to roll it up and wait until you see how these wet berries are going to start softening the dough. You see, this is just like a jelly roll, but it's just to get it all in. And now you think that they're not there anymore, but they're going to start peeking through. I can feel it, squishy. Pretty soon I'm going to need to add the flour. But that's why I love this mat. It doesn't stick nearly as quickly, even though it's getting wet. Ah, here comes the first pocket. Another really handy device to have when you're doing dough, and in fact, I never do bread dough without it being right nearby, is a bench scraper. And that's when the dough starts sticking, you can just use it as if it were an extension of your hand. And now I'm going to add a little bit more flour, even though it's not sticking to the surface. I think it will be easier to integrate. Now, what would happen if you made it too soft a dough? This is not being baked in a pan. This is being baked flat, freeform. So if you have too soft a dough, it will spread out sideways and be a funny shape. Now this takes a while because there are so many cranberries. It takes a few minutes to knead all those cranberries and nuts into the dough, and it may look like an awful lot, but don't forget, the cranberries aren't going to grow. The dough is what's going to grow, and it's going to grow maybe by 3 times at least around those cranberries. And you can see it holds together in a nice ball, but it's still sticky. I have a lot of these what I call dough risers. They're actually storage bins, and they have marks on the side. This is a kind of large one for more dough, but you would only need about a 2-quart dough riser for this amount, because then when it reaches the top, and if you're doing something else and you forget about it, the top will keep it from rising any further. But that's only if you put a weight on it, because dough is so strong. You know, the power of yeast is so great that it will blow the lid right off of something unless you put a weight on top of it. So I'm pressing it down into this greased bin, and I see the point it comes up to, and I could either use the marking or I could use a piece of tape approximately where double is. See, that's 2 quarts? But if it weren't, I would put the tape right over there, and then I know to look every once in a while. And I'm putting, usually if I don't have a good tight top, I oil the top of the dough to make sure it doesn't dry out. Otherwise, I just put the top on. You can see it makes a tight seal. And I leave it in a warm spot, 70 to 80 degree kitchen. And it takes an hour and a half till it comes up to that spot. And this is going to strengthen the dough and give it more flavor. Well, I have one that's been waiting patiently here because it's just risen to double the amount. And you can see when you put your finger in, it keeps that hole. It doesn't pop right up. And so that's another test of knowing, just in case, say you forgot to put a mark on where double the volume would be. So now, in order to distribute the yeast evenly, because remember, yeast is feeding on the flour. It's breaking down the flour, the sugars in the flour, and it's eating them. And so there might be a pocket of yeast here, but none over here. And that's part of the reason that we let it rise a second time, first pressing it out, and then giving it what's called a business letter fold. And there are many ways of doing it. You could just take it and stretch it, but this strengthens the dough, and each time you do it, it becomes stronger. You can do it one time, or watch what happens when I do it a second time. And you'll see it's harder to press out because now the dough is stronger. See how stretchy the dough is? Whereas before it was limp. I'm developing the muscle of the dough. And now give it another turn. And now, if time allows, let it rise a second time in the same way. But this time it's more filled with air. And so it's going to rise to a little higher. So when I put it in, I again put the mark on, but to where double the height would be. And see how hard it is even to press it in? Because it's so firm. And I didn't add any more flour. It just firmed up by the action of the flour, the protein. Okay, so I would put a mark up now, which would be all the way up to here. And it's going to rise. The second rise usually takes a little less time. If the first one took an hour and a half, the second will probably take an hour, or an hour and 15 minutes. And here we have yet another dough that has risen a second time. And each time it rises, it becomes more beautiful and smooth. And here's how to shape what is called in French a bâtard. We call it a torpedo because it's shaped like an elongated football.